Step aside. Preston Vance said it in the flat voice of a man who had repeated it too many times. Just as the brass doors of the priority elevator slid open, Junie Halloran stood in the middle of the cabin, both arms wrapped around an orange cold chain case, rainwater still dripping from her collar onto the floor. "Are you talking to me? Do you see anyone else standing here?" She glanced at the indicator strip on the lid. Still green, but the outer edge had begun turning yellow. "I need the 54th floor. Cold chain. Priority 1. Preston tugged his cuff straight. "This car is for scheduled guests." "Out." She moved toward the doors. He didn't step back. She turned her shoulder to slip past. Her arm brushed his sleeve, and he recoiled as though something had been spilled on him, then raised a hand to his nose and held it there. "You brought the loading dock in here with you." Junie looked out at the lobby. A young man slowed when he heard the voices, then looked down at his phone and kept walking. 2 employees at the general elevators turned away. The reception desk was only a few steps off. Nobody came. "I'll ask at the desk," she said. "Then go." She moved again. Her heel caught the metal strip between the cabin and the stone floor. She swayed, and her shoulder brushed him a second time. Preston's face hardened. "I told you to step aside." "I'm trying." He put his hand on her shoulder. Then he pushed. Junie was thrown clear of the cabin with no time to find her feet. She pitched forward, both arms flung out for something to catch, and there was nothing, only black stone rushing up at her. Her knee struck first, a short, dry sound that carried up into the high ceiling. The cold case tore loose from her arms, its lid springing open in midair, and 6 glass vials scattered like a handful of seed flung across the polished floor. The delivery slip drifted down slowest of all, turned once, and landed 3 steps away just as a leather shoe came down and left half a print across one corner. Junie lay face down on the stone, both hands still stretched out in front of her. The rolling glass went quiet. The whole lobby went quiet. She didn't move for 2 breaths, not from the pain, but because she was watching where the vials had gone. "This is exactly what I try to prevent," Preston said, standing over the mess at his feet. "People walk into places they don't belong and leave someone else to clean it up." Junie pushed herself up on one elbow. She didn't reach for her knee. She crawled to the nearest vial and turned the label up to read it, her hands shaking so badly she missed the edge of it the first time. "I was walking out," she said, very quietly. "You pushed me anyway." Preston stepped into the cabin and pressed the button to close the doors. "You should be grateful I haven't called security." The brass doors began to slide shut. At that moment, the revolving door at the main entrance turned once. Cormac Brennan came in with a black overcoat folded across his arm and rain still in his hair. He saw a woman kneeling on the stone. He saw 6 glass vials scattered around her, and he saw Preston Vance's hand still extended in front of him, in exactly the posture of a man who has just pushed someone down. Cormac did not run. He crossed the lobby no faster than usual and caught the doors before they closed. Preston spoke before he had looked properly. "This car is occupied." Then he saw who was standing there. Everything in him went soft. The contempt left his face and was replaced by a hurried smile. "Mr. Brennan, good morning." Cormac didn't answer him. He bent down, picked up the delivery slip with the shoe print on it, brushed the water off the paper, and read the recipient's name printed across the middle of the page. The lobby went silent. The 2 employees at the elevators stopped pretending to look elsewhere. Cormac straightened up, turned to the woman on the floor, and when he spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to lift her head to hear it. "What color is the strip on the lid?" "Turning yellow," she said. What neither of them knew yet was that the name printed on that slip was about to bring up something buried in this tower longer than the tower had been standing. If this story reached you, leave a like, leave a comment, share it with whoever came to mind just now, and subscribe to our channel to walk the rest of this road with us. Cormac Brennan didn't ask Preston Vance another question. He didn't even look in the man's direction. He simply raised 2 fingers to shoulder height, held them there for the span of a single breath, then lowered his hand. Across the lobby, 4 men in black coats left 4 separate positions at the same moment. One folded the newspaper he had been reading and set it down on a chair. Another stepped out of the line waiting for the regular elevators, surrendering his place to the person behind him. The other 2 came through the revolving doors from outside, bringing with them the chill of the morning and the smell of rain. None of them said a word. None of them ran. They were simply there. And Junie Halloran, still kneeling on the stone floor with a vial in her hand, suddenly understood that she had spent the entire morning standing inside a perimeter she hadn't even known existed. This lobby had never really been a lobby. It was ground that had already been secured before she ever walked through the door. Preston realized it at the same moment she did. He reached for the cuff of his suit jacket and pulled it straight, then did it again, even though there wasn't a wrinkle there. Mr. Brennan, I think we should discuss this privately upstairs. This is only a minor issue concerning access privileges. Cormac didn't answer. He turned his head toward the security desk, where Otis Gallagher stood with a tablet in his hands, and the expression of a man who had just witnessed something he hadn't wanted to see. Which camera caught his hand? Otis touched the screen, his fingertip moving a little more slowly than usual. The east ceiling angle, sir, and the camera inside the elevator car as well. Cormac nodded once. Lock the original. Make 2 copies. One for legal. Otis said yes, then lowered his eyes to the tablet and began working. And Junie saw his hand tremble slightly when he touched the screen, though his voice remained steady. Preston stepped half a pace forward. I believe that's somewhat more than necessary, if you'll hear my explanation first. Cormac still didn't look at him. He bent down. The 2 men in black coats standing nearby moved forward as if to help, but Cormac tilted his head slightly, and both of them stepped back. He picked up the vials from the stone floor himself, one by one, turning every label in the same direction, wiping the moisture from the bottom of each vial with his own handkerchief, then placing them into the foam tray inside the cooler, in the exact order in which they had been lying. 4 vials were still intact. The other 2 had faint fractures running along the glass, and he set those apart rather than returning them to the tray. No one in the lobby spoke during any of it. The only sound was glass touching foam, once, then again, barely audible. Yet in that silence it rang like the ticking of a clock in an empty room. Junie sat back on her heels, still holding the final vial, and realized something strange. This man didn't look angry at all. No one in her life had ever helped her pick something up while wearing the expression of a man conducting an inventory. Cormac closed the lid of the cooler, turned it so the indicator strip faced upward, and handed it to her. The outer edge of the strip had deepened to a darker yellow than it had been before. Can you walk? Junie stood. Her right knee betrayed her on the very first movement, and she had to shift her weight onto the other leg to keep from falling for the second time that morning. She took the cooler from him with both hands. Yes. Cormac turned and walked toward the open priority elevator car. And when he passed Preston, he didn't stop, didn't glance at him, didn't say a single word. That was what drained the color from Preston's face. A man who was being shouted at was still being acknowledged as someone present in the room. Preston had just been treated like an object that had already been put back in its proper place. The elevator doors slid shut, and the noise of the lobby was cut off as cleanly as if someone had just closed a window. Junie stood close to the right corner, both arms wrapped around the cooler against her chest, her knee still throbbing dully each time the car shifted upward. Cormac stood in the middle, his black wool coat still draped over his left arm, his eyes fixed straight ahead on the numbers climbing across the electronic display. After a few floors, the phone in his coat pocket vibrated. He pulled it out, and for the brief instant, the screen lit up before he could angle it away. Junie saw the words centered there. Pier 4, awaiting orders. He looked at the message for about a second, then turned off the screen, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and said nothing. She didn't ask. In her line of work, you learned quickly that there were certain packages where all you needed to know was the address. You didn't need to know what was inside. The elevator continued upward. The numbers on the display passed floors she had never heard anyone mention. Cormac spoke first, his voice still as quiet as it had been in the lobby, as though speaking loudly inside an enclosed space were simply unnecessary. Have you ever wondered why my mother's medication ended up in your hands? Junie glanced at him. I just figured the company received the order and I made the delivery. I have cars. I have people. I could send 2 cars in 2 different directions every time the medication needs to be collected. He kept looking straight ahead. But everyone notices a convoy. No one notices an orange jacket. Junie looked down at the left sleeve of her coat, where the elbow had worn thin and been patched with thread that didn't quite match, the stitching circling the fabric like an old scar. So you chose me because I'm invisible. I chose you because you're on time. He paused for a beat. The second thing is a consequence of the first. She didn't know whether to take that as a compliment or a confession, so she stayed silent, and the 2 of them stood that way until the elevator stopped. The doors opened onto a corridor unlike any office hallway she had ever seen. There were no desks, no department signs, no ringing phones. The entire floor held nothing but one long corridor, its carpet thick enough to swallow every footstep, and at the far end stood an open wooden door. Inside, the curtains had been drawn back to let in the light from the harbor, and on a bed near the window sat an elderly woman with silver hair, propped against a stack of pillows. Cormac stopped at the threshold and didn't enter. Junie walked in, set the cooler on the small table beside the bed, and began doing what her hands had learned long before her mind had to think about it. She opened the lid, checked the indicator strip, removed the vials one at a time, turned each label upward, held them toward the light, then tilted them gently so she could inspect the length of the glass. 2 of the vials had faint fractures, and she set them apart on one side of the tray, turned downward, exactly as she had been taught, so no one could accidentally use them. She dried the remaining 4, lined them up neatly, then pushed the tray toward the nurse who was already waiting. These 4 are safe to use. The other 2 aren't. I'll take them back and enter them into the destruction report. The elderly woman watched her from beginning to end, then she held out her hand. It was dry and light, the skin so thin that the blue veins beneath it were visible along the back, and her fingers had begun to curl slightly with age. Junie reached out by instinct and took it. How long have you been doing this, child? 4 years. Then you've kept a lot of people from falling. Junie almost said that she only delivered the medicine, that doctors were the ones who kept people from falling, not her. But something tightened in her throat, and the words never came. The old woman continued holding her hand. She didn't squeeze. She simply held it, the way someone might hold a seat for a person who was expected to arrive any moment. My name is Nuala. I'm Junie. That sounds like the name of a month. The woman laughed, a short, raspy sound, but it was real laughter. The prettiest month. Outside the doorway, Cormac remained exactly where he had been, his coat still draped over his arm. He had been standing there long enough to hear every word of the conversation, and he neither stepped inside nor turned away. For years, everyone who entered this room had been someone he paid to be there, and his mother had learned to greet every one of them with the same polite nod and the same expression. Now she was laughing with a stranger in a delivery coat, whose elbow had been patched with mismatched thread, and he stood outside the threshold watching them, unable to decide what to call the feeling inside his chest. When the elevator brought the 2 of them back down, Junie realized the lobby had changed. People were still moving through it, shoes still clicking against the stone, but no one stood near the priority elevators anymore, and the 2 benches by the revolving doors were completely empty. Preston Vance sat in a single chair placed against the eastern stone wall, both hands resting on his thighs, and about 5 steps away, a man in a black coat leaned against a column, not looking at him, yet never quite taking his attention off him either. A man around 50 came forward to meet Cormac the moment the elevator doors opened. His closely cropped hair streaked with gray, the collar of his coat turned up from having just come in out of the rain. Junie had never heard his name before, but the way people in the lobby shifted subtly aside when he passed told her enough. I've already sent the car to the garage entrance, the man said, his voice low and clipped, like someone reporting on a task already more than half completed. The cleanest thing is to take him out tonight. By tomorrow morning, no one will ever have to mention that name again. Cormac nodded. Just once. Brief. Without looking at anyone. Junie stood 3 steps away, still holding the empty cooler, and she heard both the sentence and that nod with perfect clarity. She had meant to walk straight out the door. Her feet had already turned in that direction. But then she heard the shoes of the gray-haired man moving toward the single chair against the wall, and before she had time to think about what she was doing, she stepped across the aisle and stood directly in his path. The man stopped. He didn't step back, and he didn't push her aside. He simply stood there, looking over her shoulder toward Cormac, waiting. Junie understood then that he didn't consider her an obstacle. He considered her something that hadn't yet been authorized to be there. You should go outside, he said. It's still raining, but you'll find it more comfortable out there than in here. Mr. Doyle, a woman's voice called from the reception desk. The woman was around 40, wearing a gray coat, a hardbound notebook in one hand, and a pen in the other. And no one had noticed when she had appeared there. No one has asked you to take anyone anywhere yet. Mrs. Sloane, I'm speaking to one of my own people. Junie turned and looked at Cormac. He was still standing exactly where he had been, his coat draped over his arm, his expression unchanged. I understand this has nothing to do with me, she said, but if your people take him out of this building tonight, then by tomorrow morning he'll be a missing person, and I'll be the woman who caused someone to disappear. I fell on this floor this morning, and I don't want to carry that home with me too. The entire lobby went silent. Malachi Doyle didn't move. Cormac didn't answer right away. 1 beat passed, then a second, then a third. At the reception desk, Renata Sloane quietly lowered her pen onto the notebook without making a sound, and something in her gaze sharpened into a different kind of focus. She had worked with this man long enough to know that when he stayed silent longer than 2 beats, it wasn't hesitation. It was calculation. A 4th beat passed. You think I'm stopping because of you? Junie looked straight at him. No. Good. He turned his head toward the reception desk. Mrs. Sloan, call legal down here. Compliance too. I want everyone present within half an hour. Renata picked up her pen. What reason should I enter into the record, sir? Cormac didn't answer her immediately. He lifted his eyes toward the ceiling of the lobby, toward the floors stacked one above another, disappearing upward into the mass of stone and glass, toward the floor where there was a corridor covered in thick carpet and an open wooden door. My mother is still alive, he said. As long as she's breathing, this tower stays clean. You can write it exactly like that. Malachi Doyle remained still for another moment, then took his hand out of his coat pocket, turned, and walked toward the revolving doors without saying another word. Junie was still standing in the middle of the passage, with the empty cooler in her hands, and she realized her heart was pounding hard, harder than it had when she had been lying face down on the stone floor that morning. She had thought she had just saved someone, but as she watched Cormac Brennan's back moving toward the elevators, she understood that she hadn't saved anyone at all. She had merely happened to say aloud the exact reason that man had needed in order to do what he had already decided to do. The security room sat directly behind the reception desk, much smaller than Junie had imagined, barely large enough for a row of monitors, 2 swivel chairs, and a long table around which 7 people were now standing. Renata Sloan set her hardbound notebook on the table, uncapped her pen, and told Otis Gallagher to play it from the beginning, at normal speed. No rewinding, no zooming in. Otis nodded and touched the screen. Preston Vance sat at the far end of the table, his back straight, his hands clasped together on the wood, and he began speaking before the image had even appeared. I want to make it clear from the beginning that she entered a restricted area on her own. I was standing at the reception desk and saw her walk straight into the priority elevator, without asking anyone a single question. The first image appeared from the east ceiling camera. In it, Junie stood in front of the reception desk with the cooler in her arms, waiting while the employee behind the counter dealt with 2 other visitors. She stood there for a long time. Then she looked up at the electronic sign hanging between the 2 banks of elevators, read it, and only then stepped toward the open car. Renata said nothing. She simply wrote 1 line in her notebook. Preston tugged at his cuff. I may be remembering the sequence incorrectly. What matters is that when I arrived, she was standing directly in the doorway and refused to leave. I asked her 3 times. Otis let the footage continue. On the screen, Junie moved toward the elevator doors immediately after Preston's first sentence. She stepped forward, and he shifted to block her. She angled one shoulder to slip past him, and he moved again to stop her. Throughout the entire sequence, her feet remained pointed toward the lobby. Not once did she turn back into the elevator car. Renata wrote another line. You just said she refused to leave, she said without looking up. I see her trying to leave 3 times and being blocked 3 times. Preston shifted slightly in his chair. I believe this camera angle is misleading about the distance involved. In reality, she stumbled because she caught her own foot on the edge of the floor. I did reach out, yes, but it was to steady her. She lost her balance on her own. Otis said nothing. He switched to the camera inside the elevator. From this angle, there was nothing left to misunderstand about the distance. Everyone in the room saw the arm extend straight out, saw the weight drive forward, saw the woman's shoulder jerk before her feet left the floor. Otis froze the footage on that exact frame, and for a while, no one in the room said anything. Renata set down her pen. You've given us 3 versions in less than 10 minutes, Mr. Vance. Which one would you like me to enter into the record? Preston opened his mouth, then closed it again. Just then, there was a knock at the door. A man wearing a Tidewater Company windbreaker stepped inside, his hair wet, a stack of papers and a plastic folder in his hand, and introduced himself as the morning shift coordinator. He said he had been called in to bring the original delivery order. Renata took the folder, pulled out the top sheet, read it, and then did something Junie hadn't expected. She handed the paper to her first. Junie took it. In the upper right corner, bold lettering clearly identified it as a Level 1 cold chain order, and directly beneath that was a boxed series of characters with a note stating that the order was authorized to use the priority elevator. Under the ordering unit, the name of the office of the chairman of the corporation was printed. She read that line 3 times. Ever since she had been lying face down on the stone floor, a very small voice in the back of her mind had kept asking the same questions over and over. Whether she had misread the electronic sign, whether she had made some mistake somewhere that she simply couldn't remember. Now she was holding a piece of paper that proved she hadn't made a mistake at all. She had been right from the very first second, and yet she didn't feel any lighter. She only felt the pain in her knee more sharply, and understood more clearly than ever that being right couldn't give her back the 2 cracked vials, couldn't give her back the silent lobby from that morning, couldn't give her back the feeling of lying face down on the stone while 7 people stood there watching. Renata turned toward Otis, her voice still even, as if she were simply working her way through a procedural checklist. Before I take your statement, I need to ask everything on the record. Do you know the witness, Mr. Gallagher? Otis set his tablet down on the table. No. It was the first lie of the day told by a decent man. Renata Sloane didn't ask Preston Vance another question about the shove. Instead, she moved on to something no one in the room had expected, least of all him. She asked Otis to open the priority elevator access authorization log, the entire record, going back to the beginning of the year. Otis typed a few lines, and a long table appeared on the screen. Renata scrolled down very slowly. For a long while she said nothing. Then she began reading aloud, without emphasizing a single word, simply reciting the entries as though she were reading an inventory list. 1 access authorization for a visitor without an appointment, approved by the building operations manager, no supporting documentation attached. Another authorization, same approver, no documentation. Then another, then 4 in the same week. She read about 20 entries before stopping and looking up. I've only gone through 3 months, Mr. Vance. There are 9 more. Would you like me to keep reading? Or would you prefer to tell us yourself? Preston tugged at the cuff of his suit jacket, then tugged at it a second time. Those were exceptions that came up unexpectedly. Important visitors, urgent schedules. I handled them on the spot so no one would be delayed. Not one of these people appears on the building's appointment schedule. Renata tapped the screen. And I've just cross-checked them against the visitor lists for all 18 companies with offices in this building. None of those companies invited these people here. Cormac Brennan stood leaning against the security room doorway, his coat still draped over his arm, and until that moment, he hadn't said a word. Now he stepped toward the table, bent over the screen, and scanned the entries once. Then he asked Renata, his voice still quiet, "How many have you counted? Not enough yet to give you a final number, but already too many to call exceptions." Junie stood in the corner of the room, still holding the empty cooler against her stomach, and she understood before any of the people holding pens did. She understood, because she had been doing this work for 4 years. She understood that what had made that man stop her that morning wasn't the orange coat, and it wasn't the smell of the warehouse. If an elevator was considered occupied with a delivery, then that elevator couldn't be sold to anyone else. People only paid for a door if that door was always empty when they arrived. For months, the workers in uniforms had been pushed around to the freight elevator in the basement not because someone hated uniforms. They had been pushed aside because they lowered the value of the merchandise. The contempt that everyone in this building had grown accustomed to enduring was only the outer shell, and Preston had believed that shell looked convincing enough that no one would ever think to peel it back. Otis Gallagher rose from his swivel chair. He placed his phone on the table between Renata and Cormac, and he spoke with the voice of a man who had made up his mind some time ago. "Ma'am, I have something else. He called me right after the 2 copies were made. I didn't answer. He left a message." Renata looked at him for a moment. "Do you consent to having it played?" "I brought it here to be played." Otis touched the screen. Preston's voice filled the small room, gentle, almost friendly. The voice of a man who sounded as though he were trying to help someone. He said everyone was under stress today, that there was no reason to turn a small matter into a large one, that the 2 of them had worked together for years, and that he understood Otis's circumstances better than anyone else in the building. Then he mentioned the shift review coming up next month. Then he mentioned his wife's dialysis schedule, 3 sessions a week, and said he knew how expensive those treatments could be. Finally, he told Otis to call him back before speaking to anyone else. The recording ended. No one in the room said anything. Preston sat perfectly straight, staring directly ahead, and for the first time that morning, he didn't tug at his cuff. Renata wrote 1 long line in her notebook, then closed it. Cormac picked up the personnel file that compliance had just brought downstairs, flipped through the 3 most recent performance reviews, and stopped at a sentence that appeared exactly the same in all 3. He read it silently, then looked up and addressed the entire room. Who wrote the word indispensable right beside the word demanding? And why, after all these years, did no one ask the next question? No one answered him, because the answer was all of them. And no one in that room wanted to be the first person to say it aloud. Cormac Brennan left the tower exactly once that day, and no one in the security room knew where he went. The car followed the waterfront for about 20 minutes, passing rows of shipping containers stacked one above another like a city without windows, then turned onto the concrete road leading to Pier 4. The rain still hadn't stopped. Floodlights mounted high on steel poles cast murky yellow circles across the yard, and inside each circle, every slanting thread of rain could be seen clearly. The warehouse at the far end of the pier had been empty for a long time, its rolling door raised only halfway, with no cargo left inside, only the smell of machine oil soaked deep into the concrete floor, and the scent of salt water carried in by the wind from the docks. In the middle of that vast, empty space stood exactly one plastic chair, the kind people set outside sidewalk cafes, and a man was sitting in it. Two men in black coats stood a good distance away near the rolling door, far enough that they couldn't hear anything. Cormac walked inside without removing his coat, and without brushing the rain from his shoulders. He pulled a second plastic chair from a stack against the wall, set it down opposite the man about 2 steps away, and sat. Then he reached inside his coat, took out a thick envelope, unsealed and unmarked, and placed it on the concrete floor between them, directly inside the pool of light from the lamp overhead. He didn't push it toward anyone. He simply set it down. "You moved the elevator access logs out of the building for 7 months, Cormac said. "I'm not asking why. I'm not planning to ask how much you were paid either. You have 2 ways out of this, and I'm going to tell you both, so you don't have to guess." The man in the chair didn't answer. Somewhere outside, far off in the distance, a barge sounded its horn, then fell silent. "First way. You pick that up, leave the city before daylight, and I forget your name. No one comes looking for you. No one calls you. You disappear the way a man disappears when he walks away by himself." Cormac rested both elbows on his knees and leaned slightly forward. "Second way. You stay sitting right there because you think Lachlan Arden is going to take care of you. Keep that silence if you want. I won't force a single word out of you." The man shifted in the plastic chair, and the scrape of plastic against concrete sounded unusually loud inside the empty warehouse. "Are you going to kill me?" "No." Cormac said the word with mild surprise, as though he had just been asked a question too old to be interesting anymore. "I'm going back. On the way, I'll call Ardan. I'll tell him I just sat here talking with you at Pier 4 for a very long time, longer than necessary, and that the conversation was extremely pleasant. Then I'll hang up. From that second on, I have nothing more to do with you. He'll handle the rest himself, and he does things much faster than I do." The man looked down at the envelope lying on the damp concrete floor. He stared at it for a very long time, longer than a man who was still weighing his options. Long enough that Cormac had already risen, pulled his coat collar back into place, and walked halfway toward the rolling door. There, he stopped, turned his head, and delivered the final sentence in exactly the same tone he used when speaking to a warehouse manager about how many pallets remained in inventory. "Take the envelope. I don't like waste." Then he stepped out into the rain. The 2 men in black coats didn't follow him immediately. They waited for about a minute, and during that minute, the sound of the plastic chair shifting across the concrete came once, then stopped completely. On the drive back to the tower, Cormac sat in the rear seat and looked through the window as the murky yellow circles of light receded behind them. He didn't think about the man who had just been sitting in that plastic chair. He thought about the long list Renata Sloane had only managed to read through the first 3 months of, and about a question he still hadn't been able to answer. For 7 months, someone had been buying doors inside his building. What he needed to know wasn't who had sold them. What he needed to know was what the buyer had bought them for. Renata Sloane had finished reading through the remaining 9 months by the time Cormac returned, and she didn't wait for him to take off his coat. She spread the access list across the long table in the conference room on the 53rd floor, marking with a colored pen every name that appeared more than once, and there was one name marked more often than all the others combined. Lachlan Arden, owner of the second-largest cold storage company in the Harbor District. The man who had twice made offers to buy Brennan's transport route, and had been turned down both times. "He wasn't buying convenience," Renata said. "He has no reason to be on the 53rd or 54th floor. He has no office here, no partners here, and not one of those access approvals ended with a meeting." Cormac stood looking at the list. Then what was he buying? Renata pulled out another sheet and laid it on top. It was the access schedule placed beside Tidewater's cold chain delivery schedule for those same months. The 2 columns of information sat side by side, and anyone who looked at them could immediately see what no one in that building had ever thought to place together before. Every time an orange cooler was taken up to the 54th floor, an undocumented access authorization appeared within the next few days. It wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence. They followed each other like shadow follows form. Cormac stared at the 2 columns for a long time, and when he understood, he said nothing. He simply placed both hands on the edge of the table, because what Lachlan Arden had been buying wasn't a door. He had been buying a schedule. An orange cooler going up to the 54th floor meant that on that day, Cormac Brennan would be inside the room at the end of the carpeted corridor, standing beside his mother's bed, without anyone with him, without a phone in his hand. without looking toward the door. It was the only period in the entire week when that man could be found in one fixed place, with no one standing around him. Preston Vance had sold a map leading straight to his employer, and he had sold it without ever understanding what he was actually selling. He thought he was selling convenience. He thought the people paying him simply wanted to avoid waiting in line. Renata set down her pen. "I need to tell you something before you call anyone." Cormac didn't turn around. "Go ahead. I know where you just came from. I'm not asking. But if you handle this the way your father used to handle things, I'll submit my resignation tonight, and I'll put it in writing so no one can ever pretend later that I left for health reasons." Cormac turned and looked at her. "If I handled things the way my father did, you wouldn't have been invited into this room in the first place." Renata looked at him for a moment, then nodded and began gathering her papers. That evening, the dining room on the 53rd floor was lit. The wooden table stretched so far across the room that it took 3 tablecloths to cover it, and around it stood 32 high-backed chairs, every one of them polished clean, straightened carefully, and waiting. Cormac sat at the head of the table, eating alone. The server brought out the second course. He ate a few bites, then pushed the plate away. Shay Brennan walked in, stopped in the middle of the room, and didn't pull out a chair. "Do you know what people are saying out there today? They're saying Mr. Brennan called legal all the way down to the lobby because of a delivery woman. Sit down. You're sitting here eating alone. Mother is downstairs breathing through a machine. And out there you're letting some woman holding an ice cooler tell you what to do. If Dad were still alive, this would have been finished by noon." Cormac folded his napkin, placed it beside his plate, and looked up at his younger brother. "Do you know why this table still has 31 empty chairs?" Shay stood still. "Because they're all dead. Because every one of them once thought the way you do." Shay had no answer for that. He remained there for another moment, then turned and walked out, and the sound of the closing door traveled the full length of the room, passing 31 empty chairs before finally fading at the far end of the table, where a man wealthy enough to buy the entire tower twice was sitting alone in front of a plate of food that had gone cold. Junie stayed at the tower until late afternoon because legal still needed her signature on 3 statements, and when she crossed the lobby for the last time to leave, the lights outside had already come on. Otis Gallagher was standing at the security desk, and he called her back by raising one hand rather than saying her name. On the counter sat a small plastic box, the kind people usually used for lost keys. He pushed it toward her. "This rolled under the desk this morning. I found it while I was cleaning up." Junie opened the lid. Inside was a brass fire whistle. Its surface dulled where hands had held it most often. The old leather strap broken so that only a small piece remained. 2 initials and a number had been engraved into one side. The marks shallow, the kind of hand engraving done by someone in a small shop rather than by a machine. She picked it up and realized she was gripping it more tightly than she needed to. "I thought I'd lost it." "You didn't." She was about to thank him and leave, but she stopped, because something didn't fit, and after 4 years of reading labels for a living, she was quick to notice when something didn't fit. "How did you know it was mine?" "You never saw me holding it this morning. It was under the desk with all kinds of other things." Otis didn't answer right away. He looked down at the counter, then out through the revolving doors, where rain still streaked the glass. "Because I was the one who picked it up the first time." Junie didn't understand. He continued, more slowly. "Outside that warehouse, I picked it up off the road, where they'd spread sand to soak up the water. I wiped it on my sleeve and went looking for whoever it belonged to. Then I saw a girl sitting on the sidewalk across the street, wrapped in a blanket from the ambulance crew, and I knew immediately who it belonged to. Somewhere across the lobby, someone called an elevator." Junie heard the sound clearly, more clearly than she heard her own voice. "I was 19, she said. "You were 19, he nodded. "I sat down beside you. I gave it back to you and said something. I don't remember what. Probably something meaningless. People say meaningless things on nights like that." Junie tried to remember. She truly tried. She remembered the cold sidewalk, remembered the blanket smelling of antiseptic, remembered so many men in protective gear moving back and forth in front of her all night, every face smeared with soot, every one of them looking the same, beneath the revolving lights of the fire engines. She remembered a hand placing the whistle into her palm. She didn't remember a single face. For all these years, she had kept that whistle in the inner pocket of her backpack, and not once had she ever imagined that somewhere, a man still remembered her face. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't remember you. There's nothing to apologize for. That night, it wasn't your job to remember anyone." He said it gently, but he didn't look at her when he said it. And that, the simple fact that he wouldn't look at her, made another piece fall into place inside Junie's mind. She thought back to that morning. She thought about lying face down on the stone floor, with both hands still stretched out in front of her. And she thought about where the security desk had been, in relation to where she fell. 7 steps. Maybe 8. No more. Mr. Gallagher. He was still looking toward the doors. This morning, you were 7 steps away from me. Otis said nothing. You knew who I was the moment I walked into this building, didn't you? He placed both hands flat on the security counter, palms down, and left them there. Outside, the revolving door turned once for someone leaving, then stopped. Then why did you stand there and watch me fall? He opened his mouth, then closed it, then tried again, and this time only half of the answer came out. Because I didn't dare let you see my face. Junie waited. She waited for a long time, but the other half never came. Otis Gallagher simply stood there with both palms pressed against the counter, and he didn't say another word, and Junie understood that he wasn't going to. Not tonight. She slipped the brass whistle into the pocket of her coat, thanked him, and walked toward the revolving doors. Halfway across the lobby, she turned and looked back. He was still standing exactly where she had left him, both hands still flat on the counter, like a man waiting for someone to come and take away something he had been holding for far too long. The next morning, Renata Sloan called Junie back to the tower to add one missing signature, and while she waited, Renata did something she did with every case file that passed through her hands. She checked the witness's background, not because she distrusted Junie, but because Preston Vance's lawyer would certainly do it first, and Renata didn't like being surprised in any proceeding. She searched the name Halloran in the city's public records system, and the first name that appeared wasn't Junie's. It was Dermot Halloran, firefighter, killed in the line of duty at a warehouse in the Harbor District. Renata opened the case file out of professional habit, and for no other reason. She read the first section, then stopped at the entry listing the property owner, and she read that line 3 times. The warehouse that night belonged to a freight and storage company, and that company appeared on the list of subsidiaries under the Brennan Corporation. She scrolled farther down. The investigation report concluded that the cause had been a roof structure unable to bear the load. But on the final page, there was one detail that only someone in her profession would have noticed. The report carried the mark of an amendment made after it had already been signed, and the original version before the amendment hadn't been preserved with the file. The section assigning responsibility had been left blank. No one had been named. No one had been disciplined. Junie walked into the records room while Renata still had the file open on the screen, and Renata didn't have time to close it. Junie saw her father's name on the monitor before she saw anything else in the room. Then she saw the line identifying the owner. She stopped in the middle of the room, one hand still holding the brass whistle because she had taken it out of her coat pocket while riding the elevator and couldn't remember why she had done it. Renata rose from her chair. Miss Halloran, I only opened this a few minutes ago. I haven't had time to tell anyone yet. Junie didn't answer. She read the line again, slowly, one word at a time, the same way she read medication labels beneath the light from a window. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Then the door opened, and Cormac Brennan entered with a stack of papers in his hand. He took 2 steps and stopped. He looked at the screen. Then he looked at Junie's face. And in that brief span of time, he understood the sequence of everything that had happened. Miss Halloran. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She tried again, and this time she managed 3 words. My father. Then she stopped, because she didn't know what the rest of that sentence was supposed to be. My father died in your family's warehouse. My father died, and no one was ever named. My father died, and yesterday I stood in the middle of a passageway to save one of your people from something terrible. All 3 endings were true, and she couldn't say any of them. Cormac opened his mouth too. He was a man who could sit across from a traitor in an empty warehouse without changing the tone of his voice. But now he couldn't find a single sentence. I didn't. He stopped. The 2 of them stood there, each holding half of a sentence, and neither one could make it whole. Junie slipped the brass whistle into her coat pocket. She removed the visitor badge from her collar, placed it on the table beside the computer, and pushed it toward Renata with the tips of 2 fingers. Then she walked out. No one called her back. Outside, it was raining again. She didn't call for a car. She walked, all the way along the waterfront avenue, past cranes standing motionless like animals that had been asleep for years, past Pier 2, past Pier 3, and when she reached the area near Pier 4, she turned beneath an overhang and stood there for a long time, looking out at the gray water. She took out her phone. She blocked his number. She called the morning shift coordinator and asked to be reassigned, and when he asked why, she only said that she wouldn't take Meridian Harbor orders anymore, wouldn't take any orders from that building again, and asked him not to press her for an explanation. He was silent for a moment, then said, "All right." On the 53rd floor, Renata Sloane sat in front of the darkened screen and didn't close the file. Cormac stood at the window looking down at the avenue, watching an orange coat move farther and farther away beneath the rain, growing smaller with every step until it disappeared completely behind the rows of containers. An entire machine had been running through that harbor district for 4 generations, with lawyers, gatekeepers, cars, money, envelopes, and empty warehouses. And that morning it faltered, not because anyone had attacked it, but because one person had quietly walked out of it and never looked back. That afternoon, Otis Gallagher asked to see Renata Sloane. He didn't call, and he didn't send an internal message. He went up to the 53rd floor, knocked on the conference room door, and when Renata opened it, he told her he wanted to give a statement about something that had nothing to do with Mr. Vance. Renata invited him inside. Cormac was sitting at the head of the table with a stack of papers he hadn't finished reading, and he didn't stand up or ask a question. Otis didn't sit down. He placed a yellowed file envelope on the table, the kind with a string wrapped around a button closure, and rested his hand on it for a moment, before pulling it away. "Mrs. Sloane, I know you opened the file on the warehouse case in the Harbor District. I know because Miss Halloran walked out of this building this morning and didn't come back. I was at the security desk. I saw everything." Renata opened her hardbound notebook. "Do you want me to record this? That's why I came up here," he continued, speaking in the voice of a man who had recited this story in his own head so many times that he no longer had to search for the words. "That night I was with Company 19. After everything was over, 3 of us were asked to come to an office in the Harbor District. They gave us a report that had already been prepared and told us it was the final version, that all we had to do was sign the section for witnesses at the scene. We read it. There wasn't a single word in it about the warehouse carrying more weight than it was allowed to bear. There wasn't a single word about who had ordered more cargo loaded that night." Renata stopped writing. "Did you say anything at the time?" "I asked why that part wasn't there. They told me it belonged to a separate investigation." Otis looked down at the table. "I signed. No one in the room said anything." He straightened a little, as though preparing himself for the hardest part. "When I walked out, someone handed me an envelope. No one called it anything. No one said a word. They just handed it to me, and I took it." Renata wrote. Cormac wrote nothing. He sat motionless at the head of the table, both hands resting on the papers in front of him, and he didn't ask who had handed Otis that envelope. He didn't ask because he didn't need to. He knew who had been running the Harbor District that night. He knew which office in the Harbor District Otis meant, and he knew who in his family had a habit of handing over envelopes without saying a word. "My wife's name is Marguerite," Otis said. "That year she started her first course of treatment. The department insurance didn't cover all of it. I did the numbers. I sat at the kitchen table all night with a pocket calculator, and I couldn't make any number come out high enough. That envelope paid for her first 3 rounds. He paused, then finished the thought. "I didn't spend a single dollar of it on anything else. I want you to write that down clearly, not because it excuses me, but because it's the truth." Renata nodded and wrote it down. "Did you stay with the department after that?" "I resigned. I couldn't stay. Then I started looking for security work." Otis raised his eyes, and for the first time during the entire conversation, he looked directly at Cormac. "I applied to this building. I knew who owned it. I knew exactly who owned it. They asked me why I wanted the morning shift in the lobby, and I told them it was because I was used to waking up early." Cormac still said nothing. "All those years, I stood behind that desk out there," Otis said, "and I kept telling myself I was there to make up for it, that if I stood in that exact place long enough, one day something would happen, and I would do the right thing. Yesterday morning, something finally did happen. His daughter was lying face down on the stone floor 7 steps away from me." He stopped. No one urged him to continue. I didn't step forward. I kept thinking I was making amends. Turns out all those years, I was only guarding the door for a lie. He unwound the string from the button on the file envelope and pulled out a stack of papers, their edges yellowed with age. "That night, I asked for a copy before I signed. I said I wanted to take it home and read it carefully again. They gave me one. I suppose they thought I wouldn't dare keep it. I kept it in the bottom drawer of a cabinet at home, underneath some old uniforms, and I haven't taken it out once since." Renata picked up the papers. She read the first page, then turned to the last, and stayed there for a long time. On that final page, in the section that had been left blank in the city's copy, there were 4 typed lines and 1 name. Otis watched Renata read them, then said the last thing he had to say, not to anyone in the room in particular. "I didn't come up here to ask her to forgive me. She isn't even here. There were 3 signature lines on the final page of the original report. The first bore the name Otis Gallagher. The second belonged to a man Renata discovered had died many years ago. The third was a woman's name, and beneath it was the title head nurse of the intensive care unit at the hospital nearest the Harbor District. Renata spent the entire afternoon trying to find an address, and by the time she found one, she hadn't yet had a chance to call. The next morning, the receptionist downstairs called the 53rd floor to say that an elderly woman had arrived asking for legal, without an appointment, having come by taxi on her own, and that she said she would sit in the lobby and wait as long as necessary. Renata went down herself. The old woman was sitting on the bench near the revolving doors, her white hair cut short, both hands resting on the handbag in her lap, the shoulders of her cloth coat still damp from the rain. She introduced herself as Adeline Frost, and said she had retired after 41 years in intensive care. "Did you know we were going to contact you?" "No." The old woman opened her handbag and took out a local newspaper folded into quarters. "I read this." Renata looked down. It was a short report about the incident in the building lobby, with no photograph, and it included the last name of the woman who had been pushed down. "I've spent all these years waiting for someone to knock on my door," Adeline said. "No one ever came. I kept thinking maybe everyone had forgotten, or maybe no one wanted to remember. Then I read this name, and I knew it was the girl. She's still alive, she's still working, and she still managed to get back up after someone pushed her down. So I got into a taxi and came here myself." They brought her upstairs to the conference room. Cormac stood when she entered, pulled out a chair for her, and she thanked him with the brief nod of a woman who had spent 41 years accustomed to people pulling out chairs for her. Renata placed the original report on the table and pointed to the 3rd signature. Adeline looked at her own name, then reached out and touched it very lightly, as though touching an old scar on someone else's hand. "I signed this," she said. "I signed as the receiving nurse for the unit. They told me I only needed to verify the medical section." She began to tell the story, and her voice remained level, clear, without trembling once, the voice of someone who had spent a lifetime giving terrible news to hundreds of families in hospital corridors. She had been on duty that night. The first ambulance to arrive was from Company 19. They said the warehouse had been stacked too high with cargo, and once the smoke thickened, no one could see the passageways anymore. The crew brought out 2 people on the first entry and 1 on the second. Then someone on the team counted the overnight workers again and realized 1 person was missing. "A 19-year-old young man who worked the night loading shift," Adeline said. "He had only been there a few weeks, so his name hadn't even been printed on the main roster yet. It was handwritten on an additional sheet. They almost failed to count him at all." She paused for a moment. "Mr. Halloran went back in a 3rd time. No one in the conference room moved. The young man made it out. They brought him to me close to dawn. He had inhaled a great deal of smoke and needed oxygen for several days, but he survived." Adeline placed both hands on the table. "Mr. Halloran didn't come back out. The roof collapsed before he could make it back to the door." Renata set down her pen. Cormac sat perfectly still. "The next morning, they brought me a report that had already been typed." Adeline continued. "Under cause, it said only that the roof structure had failed under excessive load. There wasn't one word explaining why the warehouse had been carrying more than the permitted amount that night, and there wasn't one word explaining what Mr. Halloran had gone back inside a 3rd time to do. I asked about it. They told me that part wasn't under the authority of my department." She looked down at her signature again. "I signed it. I signed because I thought that if I didn't, someone else would, and I still had 32 beds in my unit to take care of. All my life, I hoped someone would ask me one question about that night. No one ever did." Cormac asked her then, and it was the first thing he had said since she entered the room. His voice was rougher than usual. "Do you remember the young man's name?" Adeline Frost opened her handbag, took out a worn, hardbound notebook, turned to a page she had marked before leaving home, and rotated the notebook toward him. "I wrote down every case I ever handled. 41 years. Not a single one missing." Cormac lowered his eyes to the handwritten line. Then he didn't say anything more. On the ruled page, beneath the entry for the patient admitted that night, written in blue ink faded by the passing years, was the name of his younger brother. After Adeline Frost left, Renata Sloan remained alone in the conference room for a very long time. She didn't reopen the warehouse case file. Instead, she returned to what she had left unfinished the day before, because she was the kind of person who couldn't sleep when there was an itch in her mind until she had scratched all the way down to its source. Her itch lay in the 2 columns of numbers she had placed side by side. The first time, she had arranged them to prove that whenever an orange cooler went up, an undocumented access authorization appeared a few days later. Now she reversed the process. She took every recorded instance of an orange cooler being brought up to the 54th floor in the building's access log, then checked each one against the official delivery schedule Tidewater had provided. She spent the entire afternoon doing it, tracing each line with the tip of her pen, and she found 9 that didn't match. 9 times, an orange cooler had been entered into the security desk log, granted access to the priority elevator, and taken up to the 54th floor. Those 9 deliveries didn't appear anywhere on Tidewater's schedule. They weren't made by Junie Halloran. They weren't made by anyone from that company. Renata called the morning shift coordinator and read the dates to him one by one, and after checking them, he answered in the voice of a man who was beginning to feel a chill run down his spine. On those dates, his company hadn't received a single order for that building. The patient's treatment schedule on the 54th floor was fixed, and he knew it as well as he knew the palm of his own hand. Renata then called operations and asked whether anyone still had hallway camera footage from those dates. She was told that the cameras in the 54th floor corridor had been removed from the shared archive under a security request, and that the request had been signed by the building operations manager. She set down the receiver. She sat still for a while, and in that silence, she fitted the remaining pieces together. Slowly, the way someone peels away a bandage from a wound they already know is deep. Someone had used the exact same color cooler, the exact same uniform, the exact same route Preston Vance had sold. 9 times, someone wearing an orange coat and carrying a cooler had walked through that lobby, past the security desk, entered the priority elevator, crossed the corridor whose thick carpet swallowed every footstep, and stepped into the room at the end of the hall. 9 times, that person had stood inside Nuala Brennan's room. Renata knocked on Cormac's office door and laid it out in exactly the order she had discovered it, without adding a word and without leaving one out. She placed the sheet with 9 circled entries in front of him. Cormac didn't pick it up. He only looked at it. He looked for a very long time, longer than he had looked at anything else in the past 2 days, and throughout that entire stretch, he didn't speak, didn't change position, didn't blink any more than usual. Renata had worked with this man long enough to know she should stay silent. Then he stood. He fastened one button of his suit jacket with the slow movement of a man trying to keep his hands occupied. He said exactly one sentence to her, his voice as even as ever, so even that the steadiness itself made a chill pass through her. "You stay here. I'm stepping out for a little while." Then he walked out and closed the door behind him. Renata didn't see his face again from the moment the door hid it from view. She only sat there in front of the sheet with 9 circled lines and heard his hand tighten around the doorknob on the other side. It was the sound of metal being twisted past its limit, very brief and dry, like the sound of a joint slipping out of place. Then came the sound of footsteps receding down the hallway. When Renata stepped out of the room about 10 minutes later, she had to turn the doorknob twice before it opened, because it was no longer straight. Junie was loading boxes into the van at the company warehouse when her phone vibrated. Unknown number. She was going to let it ring until it stopped on its own, because for the past 2 days she hadn't answered a single call from any number she didn't recognize. But it kept vibrating for too long, longer than an automated call would have been patient enough to wait, and in the end she answered. On the other end was the voice of an elderly woman, slightly short of breath, with pauses between sentences that Junie recognized immediately as pauses for air, rather than pauses for thought. "Junie, is that you, child?" The prettiest month of the year, Junie stopped in the middle of the warehouse, one hand still gripping the edge of a box. "Mrs. Nuala, I dialed the number myself. I had to ask the nurse how to look at the call history, and it took me a while to figure it out. My hands are slow now." The old woman paused, breathed, then continued. "I'll say this right away so you don't have to guess. I'm not calling on behalf of my son. He doesn't know I'm calling. If he did, he'd probably try to stop me, and I wouldn't listen to him anyway." Junie didn't answer. Out in the warehouse yard, a forklift passed by. Then the sound faded. "I know you left that building," Nuala said. "I'm not asking why. When someone leaves, they have their reasons, and I've lived long enough to understand that those reasons are usually right." Junie bit her lip. "Mrs. Nuala, let me finish first." Her voice slowed. "I'm calling because I don't have much time left to say this to anyone. I could say it to my son, but he'd listen the way he always listens, which means he'd start trying to fix something instead of sitting still and hearing me. I could say it to his younger brother, but that boy is still too young. I've thought about it for a long time, and I chose you." Junie lifted a hand to wipe her cheek, and was startled to find it wet, because she hadn't realized she was crying. "Why me?" "Because that day you came into my room and did your job properly, not just enough to get it done. I've been lying here a long time, child. I know the difference. She took another breath. And because you're the only person in that entire building who dared to stand in the middle of a passageway and block it. That part I heard about afterward. Junie closed her eyes. In her mind, she saw the words on the records room screen. Her father's name, the name of the company that owned the warehouse, and the section assigning responsibility left blank. Then she saw the old woman's dry, weightless hand resting in her palm. The two images refused to exist together. And Junie had spent the past 2 days trying to put them in separate places in her mind and failing. I'm not asking you to come back, Nuala said. I'm only telling you that I'm waiting. When you feel you can, you come. Then she added one final sentence, and she said it very softly, almost as though she were speaking to herself. I don't have many afternoons left. The call ended. Junie stood in the middle of the warehouse, her hand still gripping the edge of the box she hadn't loaded into the van yet, and she remained that way until a coworker from the morning shift walked past and asked if she was all right. She shook her head. That afternoon, she called the coordinator and told him she wanted her old route back. He asked if she was sure. She said she was. But when she set the phone down, she knew exactly who she was going back for. She wasn't going back for the man who stood at the window on the 53rd floor. She was going back for a silver-haired old woman who had needed to ask her nurse how to check her call history, just so she could dial a delivery woman's number with her own hands. Junie arrived in the Meridian Harbor lobby on Wednesday morning with her cooler in her arms. And she noticed immediately that another orange cooler had arrived before she had. It sat on the security counter beside the elbow of a man wearing a delivery jacket, and he was waiting while Otis Gallagher entered him into the log. Junie slowed down. She didn't know why. Maybe because in this line of work people remembered one another's faces, and she didn't remember his. Maybe because the cooler was too clean. She set her own cooler down on the counter beside it, and while Otis lowered his head to write, she glanced over. The indicator strip on the lid was still green. Evenly green, perfectly green. Green like a cooler that had just come out of cold storage. Then her eyes moved down to the edge of the lid, where the seal was attached. Cold chain seals were machine cut at the packaging plant, cut in a straight line, and that line always passed directly through the center of the 2 plastic eyelets on the lid. The cut on this cooler was off. Only slightly, off by about the thickness of a strand of hair, but it was off. And along the lower edge of the paper there was a thin smear of adhesive extending just beyond the seal. The kind of mark left when someone had resealed it by hand. For 4 years, she had applied and peeled off those seals every day. She reached out and snatched the cooler away. The man spun around. What are you doing? What company are you with? Take your hands off that. Read me the batch code. Otis looked up. Junie had already stepped back 2 paces, clutching the cooler tightly against her chest, and she shouted Renata Sloane's name, shouted as loudly as she could, her voice breaking across the stone lobby. The man didn't shout back. He turned and ran. He didn't run toward the revolving doors. He ran toward the western corridor, where a steel door led into the emergency stairwell, and he ran like someone who had taken that route many times before. Otis slammed his hand down on the alarm button. The siren screamed. 2 men in black coats near the revolving doors sprang from where they had been standing. Junie set the cooler on the floor and ran after him. She didn't think. Her knee protested on the 3rd stride, but she didn't stop. The steel door struck the wall with a loud bang, then rebounded. Inside the stairwell, the sound of running footsteps multiplied, echoing from one floor to another until it was impossible to tell whether they were going up or down. He was going up. Junie rushed into the stairwell, one hand gripping the iron railing, and heard her own shoes striking the concrete steps. Above her, 1 floor or perhaps 2, another door opened. Then there was the sound of footsteps stopping abruptly, then silence. She reached the landing and saw why. Cormac Brennan was standing in the middle of it, blocking the way, one hand still holding the edge of the door he had just pushed open. He wasn't breathing hard. The other man stood 3 steps below him, and in those 3 steps he had already calculated that he wasn't getting past. He turned his head, preparing to run back down. Junie was below him. He looked at her, then charged straight downward. Cormac took 1 long step off the landing. There was the sound of coat fabric, scraping against coat fabric, the sound of a hand gripping the iron railing and then sliding loose. The man was yanked backward, his back striking the concrete wall with a dull thud, and the 2 of them staggered another half-turn across the narrow landing. There was breathing, fast, 2 people, overlapping. There was the sound of a shoe dragging hard across the concrete. Then, something fell from a coat pocket, struck the first stair, slid down 2 more, and came to rest at an angle on the edge of the 3rd step. It was a phone. Cormac forced the man face down onto the landing and held him there with 1 knee, and everything stopped. Inside the stairwell, There was nothing left but the alarm echoing upward from the lobby below and the sound of 3 people breathing. A door on the floor beneath them burst open. Malachi Doyle reached the landing with 2 men in black coats. He looked at the man lying face down, then at Cormac, then stepped forward and reached inside his coat. Junie rose from the stair. She climbed 2 steps and placed her hand over Malachi Doyle's wrist. "Don't." He didn't pull his hand away. He didn't push forward either. He simply stood there with his wrist beneath her hand, looking over her shoulder toward Cormac, waiting, exactly the same way he had waited in the lobby a few days earlier. Junie didn't turn to look at Cormac. She looked directly into the eyes of the gray-haired man. "That phone can say a lot more than you can." Cormac raised his head. He looked at her for a moment, at her small hand resting on the wrist of a man a full head taller than she was, and he had seen that exact posture once before. He said 2 words, "Put it away." Malachi Doyle withdrew his hand from inside his coat. It was empty. He stepped back once and said nothing. Junie went down 3 steps, bent over, and picked up the phone lying at an angle on the edge of the stair. The screen was still lit. Junie didn't unlock the phone. She didn't need to. The lock screen still showed the preview of the last message that had just been sent, and on the recipient line were 2 initials, followed by a surname that everyone in the building had been hearing for days. She handed the phone to Renata Sloan when Renata reached the landing, and Renata took it with both hands without touching the screen, then immediately called legal and requested that it be sealed as evidence. The man was taken downstairs with Harbor District Police accompanying him, and the cooler with the misaligned cut was placed separately in a preservation bag to await examination. By noon that day, the Meridian Harbor lobby looked unlike any noon it had ever seen before. Without anyone telling them to, people simply stopped. Employees coming down from the upper floors for lunch stood still. The people at reception stopped answering the phones. Preston Vance was brought out from the waiting room into the middle of the lobby between 2 of his own attorneys, and he was still wearing his tailored charcoal gray suit, still holding his back straight, but the cuff of his right sleeve was wrinkled now, and he no longer bothered to straighten it. Renata read aloud the opening section of the report, without emphasis, simply reading. She read the number of undocumented access authorizations. She read the name of the person who had approved them. She read the 9 orange coolers that appeared nowhere on the delivery schedule. She read the request to remove the 54th floor corridor cameras from the shared archive, and the name of the person who had signed that request. Then she read the final line, about the message that had just been sent from the western stairwell, and who had received it. Preston had been shaking his head since halfway through. "I never knew what was inside those coolers. I authorized access. That was my job. I've worked in this building longer than anyone standing here, and not once have I allowed a meeting to be delayed." No one answered him. "You're turning an administrative matter into a criminal case. I kept the executive area clean, orderly, and up to standard. If I hadn't enforced those standards, this lobby would be full of people in protective gear walking back and forth in front of clients." He lifted his head and looked around, searching for a single face willing to nod in agreement, and found none. "I protected the image of this company. That's all I ever did." There was the sound of a handbag being placed on the bench near the revolving doors. Adeline Frost stood up. She had been sitting there since morning because Renata had invited her back to sign a supplemental statement, and no one had noticed her all day. She walked forward several steps and stopped about 3 paces from Preston, then spoke in the clear, steady voice of someone who had once needed an entire hospital corridor to hear her. "You didn't push a girl." Preston turned toward her. "Who are you?" "You pushed a medication supply line." She didn't take her eyes off him. "I spent 41 years in intensive care. I know what it means when a shipment arrives late. I know what it means when a shipment arrives with the seal already cut. You stand here talking about the image of a company, while I've signed papers for families who had to receive terrible news in hospital corridors because something didn't arrive in time." Preston opened his mouth. She continued before he could interrupt. "All my life, I only wanted someone to ask me one question. Just one. No one ever did. So today, I'm saying it myself." The lobby fell silent. Preston looked around again, then turned to his attorneys and said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, that he wanted the record to show that he objected to the entire process, and that in 14 years, no one had ever complained about the way he did his job. They took him out through the side door, not through the revolving doors. That afternoon, Renata Sloan transferred the entire case file to the authorities, together with the sealed phone, the access logs, the 9 circled entries, and the name of the man who had paid the highest price among all the buyers. She kept one copy locked inside the legal department safe, and on the front of the file, she wrote a single line, stating that this case had begun with a delivery slip marked by the sole of a shoe. That evening, There were only 4 people in the conference room on the 53rd floor. Renata Sloan placed 2 documents on the table, about a handspan apart, and she didn't push either one toward anyone. "I'm laying out both options, so you don't have to listen to me give advice," she said. "I practice law. I don't practice conscience." The document on the left was the first option. The Harbor District warehouse case would remain exactly as it was. The original report Otis Gallagher had turned over would stay locked in the legal department's safe, preserved as an internal document, and never made public. No one would be violating anything, because the statute of limitations on matters like this had expired long ago, and there was no legal obligation requiring the corporation to reopen something the city had already closed. The transport route would remain intact. All 3 piers would remain intact. The Brennan name would stay clean on every official record, and the Preston Vance case would continue on its own as an ugly but isolated personnel scandal. The document on the right was the second option. The corporation would voluntarily submit the original report to the authorities, together with the statements from Otis Gallagher and Adeline Frost. Renata read the consequences in the same voice she used when reading a list. The licensing authorities would reopen the corporation's entire warehouse safety record, not just one warehouse, but all of them. The 3 harbor piers would almost certainly have their operating licenses suspended during the review. And at that scale, the review wouldn't be measured in months. Long-term transport contracts would contain provisions allowing partners to withdraw. And the final consequence? She read a little more slowly. The person who had ordered additional cargo loaded into the warehouse that night was named in the original report. He was dead. Once the file became public, that name would leave this room and could never be brought back inside it again. "No," Malachi Doyle rose from his chair. "You listened to me once, and after that, you can do whatever you want. He's been in the ground for 4 years. He can't defend himself. You're going to take his name and lay it out on a table for people to tear apart? Sit down, Mr. Doyle." "I'm not sitting down. I've been standing here since before you even knew where this tower was going to be built. Do you know how many people depend on those 3 piers? 400. And that doesn't include contractors. You sign the paper on the right. That's 400 kitchens going cold. And for what? Because of an old piece of paper no one even remembers. It's not old to the people who are still alive," Renata said. "You stay out of this. Mr. Doyle." Cormac didn't raise his voice. Malachi stopped. Cormac remained seated at the head of the table for a long time. He didn't look at either document. He looked toward the window, where the harbor lights had come on outside and the cranes stood in a black row against a sky still holding the last trace of daylight. Renata knew he was calculating, and she knew exactly what he was calculating, because she had written the sentence down in her notebook a few days earlier, in her own handwriting, after he had said it in the middle of the lobby, in front of more than a dozen people. "As long as my mother is breathing, this tower stays clean." That morning, the doctor had gone up to the 54th floor twice. In the afternoon, they went up a 3rd time, and that time they stayed longer, then came down and spoke to him in the hallway, in the tone people used when there was nothing left to discuss about a treatment plan. Cormac pulled the document on the right toward himself. He read it again from the beginning, all 4 pages, without skipping a single line. Then he uncapped his pen and signed. He signed alone. No one stood beside him. The woman he wanted to see him differently was several miles away at that moment, in a kitchen in Dorchester, and she wouldn't know anything about what he had done until it appeared on the evening news. Renata pulled the document back toward herself and signed in the section for the drafter. Then she slid it to the final section, the witness signature line. No one said anything. Malachi Doyle stared at that empty space for a very long time. Then he stepped toward the table, picked up the pen, and signed. "I followed your father for 30 years, he said without lifting his head. "I followed you because I thought you were like him. Now I'm staying because you're not." Junie went up to the 54th floor the following afternoon, without a cooler, carrying nothing except the brass whistle in her coat pocket, because she had grown used to having it with her. The corridor was still covered in thick carpet that swallowed every footstep, but this time there was an extra chair at the far end, and a nurse sat there with a notebook resting on her lap. The bedroom door was still open. Nuala Brennan was lying more upright than before, pillows stacked behind her back, and someone had carefully combed her hair. She turned her head toward the doorway before Junie had a chance to knock. "I knew it was you." "How did you know?" "Your shoes make the lightest sound in this entire building." Junie pulled a chair closer and sat beside the bed. The old woman held out her hand, and Junie took it, and today that hand felt lighter than it had before. "Open the bottom drawer for me." Inside the drawer was a square tin box, the kind of cookie tin people kept after the holidays because it seemed a shame to throw it away. The lid was scratched, The printed pattern had faded almost completely, and one corner was dented. Junie placed it on Nuala's lap. Open it. There wasn't much inside. A few small photographs. A man's wedding ring threaded onto a chain. And at the very bottom, a newspaper clipping folded into quarters. The paper yellowed with age, and the creases worn so thin they were nearly torn through. Junie unfolded it. It was a short article about the warehouse fire in the harbor district, less than a single column, and her father's name was printed in it. I cut it out the day I read it, Nuala said. Then I folded it 4 times and put it in this box. I haven't opened it once since. Junie looked up. You never read it? I made it through the first 3 lines. When I reached his name, I couldn't read anymore, so I folded it back up. The old woman looked down at her own hands. I knew that warehouse belonged to our family. I knew even then. My husband came home that night and sat in the kitchen until morning, and I didn't ask him a single question. That's how I lived for 40 years in this family, child. I didn't ask. I kept thinking that if I didn't ask, then I was clean. Junie said nothing. She held the clipping in her hands and was struck by how impossibly light it felt. You keep it for me now, Nuala said. I've kept it long enough. Junie folded it along the same 4 old creases and slipped it into her coat pocket beside the brass whistle. The old woman was silent for a while, taking several breaths. Then she continued in a completely different voice, lower and more alert. There's one more thing I have to tell you, and I'm telling you because I can't tell anyone else. Junie sat straighter. Someone came into this room. She didn't understand at first. A stranger, Nuala said. Not a doctor, not a nurse, not family. Someone came in during the day wearing an orange coat, carrying a cooler the way you carry yours. They put the cooler down on that table, then walked all the way around my bed. A chill ran down Junie's spine. I closed my eyes and pretended to be asleep. I'm old. People don't think I can still hear much. But I heard. I heard the shoes move from the foot of the bed to the window, then over to the cabinet, then back again. She paused. I counted 7 times. 7 times? 7 times. Junie placed her hand on the bed rail. Why didn't you tell anyone? What do you think would have happened if I had? Junie couldn't answer. If I'd said something, my son would have gone looking for that person. Nuala said slowly, 1 word at a time. And he would have found them. He always finds them. Then that person would have disappeared. And everything I've spent the last 3 years trying to teach him would have been for nothing. Her eyes never left Junie's face. I thought it through, child. I'd rather lose the last few months I have than watch him become the man he used to be again. Junie raised a hand over her mouth. She couldn't speak. She was thinking about 7 times a stranger had walked around this bed, and about an old woman lying there with her eyes closed, counting every circuit, choosing to remain inside that danger in order to protect something she never once named aloud. Now I'm telling you, Nuala said, because you're the only person in this building who has ever dared to stop his hand. I've heard the whole story. Twice. Junie shook her head. I'm not the person. You are. The old woman squeezed her hand, very lightly, only enough for Junie to know she was squeezing. I'm not asking you to forgive my family. I don't have the right to ask that. I'm only asking you for one thing. She looked at Junie for a long time. When you look at Cormac, don't see his father. Cormac handed Adeline Frost's worn notebook to Shay in the dining room on the 53rd floor, already open to the marked page, and at first, he said nothing. Shay read the handwritten line in faded blue ink, read his own name under the entry for the patient admitted that night, then looked up. I already knew this part. I was in the hospital for a few days. I remember. Read the line above it. Shay read it. Then he read it again. Then he set the notebook down on the table, as though it had suddenly become heavy. He went back in a 3rd time. Because one person was still missing from the night shift roster, Cormac said. Your name was handwritten on the supplemental sheet. They almost didn't count you. Shay sat motionless for a very long time. Just a few days earlier, he had been standing in the middle of this same room, saying that if their father were still alive, everything would have been finished by noon. Did he make it out? No. The following afternoon, the 2 brothers drove to Southie. The old church stood on a street corner, its red brick walls faded with age, and in the side courtyard there was a row of small stone memorials set close against the wall, the kind erected for people from the neighborhood who had died while doing their jobs. Cormac stopped in front of the 4th stone from the end. Engraved on it was the name Dermot Halloran, Company 19, and beneath that was a short line stating that the memorial had been donated anonymously. In the kitchen of Junie's home in Dorchester, the television was tuned to the evening news, and she was washing dishes when she heard the name Brennan. She turned off the faucet. The news anchor said that Brennan Corporation had voluntarily submitted an old set of records to the authorities concerning an accident in the harbor district many years earlier. that operating licenses for 3 piers had been suspended that same day, and that according to internal sources, the disclosure had been initiated entirely by the corporation, without any demand from an outside agency. Junie stood there with soap suds still covering both hands. No one had called to tell her. No one had sent her a single message. That man had signed those papers in a room where she wasn't present, and he hadn't intended to tell her about it either. In the side courtyard of the church, Shea Brennan lowered himself to his knees in front of the 4th stone. He didn't say anything. He simply reached out and touched the engraved letters, reading them with his fingertips the way a blind man reads, then bowed his head and remained that way. Cormac stood behind his younger brother, about 1 step away, and he didn't kneel. He reached inside his shirt for the chain holding his father's wedding ring, the one he always wore, and closed his fist around it until the metal band pressed a mark into his skin. For all these years, his family had been paying for the upkeep of this memorial through a church account, and for all these years, he had assumed it was just another charitable expense among hundreds of others. Now he stood before it and understood that his father had erected this stone to repay a debt he had never dared to name, and had paid it in the safest possible way, one that ensured no one could ever trace it back to him. In the kitchen, Winnie sat at the table with the orange coat spread out in front of her and a needle threaded with blue string. She was 8 years old, her hair tied into 2 ponytails, the tip of her tongue sticking out at one corner of her mouth in concentration. Junie, we're out of orange thread. Then use whatever we have. Blue? Blue is pretty. The little girl stitched, and the blue thread wandered crookedly across the elbow like a road on a hand-drawn map. She lifted the sleeve to inspect it, then her face fell. But it's really ugly. Junie dried her hands on a towel, sat down beside her, and took the sleeve in her hands. She looked at the tangled blue stitches for a long time. It's not ugly. It is. It tells people there's someone at home waiting for me. Winnie thought about that for a moment, then nodded as though it were a perfectly reasonable argument, and continued sewing the last section. Afterward, the 2 sisters baked cookies, the buttery kind their mother used to make, and flour covered the entire table. While they waited for the oven, Winnie searched through the pockets of her sister's coat and pulled out the brass whistle. Does this thing make noise? Try it. The little girl put it to her lips, took a deep breath, and blew. The whistle screamed through the small kitchen, sharp and piercing, making both of them jump. And then Winnie burst into laughter, laughing so hard she had to clutch her stomach, laughing until Junie started laughing too. The little girl knew nothing about a lobby paved in black stone in the seaport. Her sister hadn't told her, and she never would. Nuala Brennan died at the end of spring, in the room at the end of the corridor, on an afternoon when sunlight spilled across the wall. Her ashes weren't kept in the tower where her son had built an entire floor so she would never have to lie in a hospital. Cormac took her to Southie and placed her in the red brick church, where she had once attended Mass as a young woman, only a few dozen steps from the row of stone memorials along the side courtyard. By the summer of that year, Meridian Harbor Tower had changed owners. The lettering on the lobby wall was taken down one morning, and the priority elevator with its brass doors now carried the name of another company. Cormac ran what remained of the business from a 2-story office by the waterfront, with a low roof, ordinary glass doors, no revolving entrance, and no one standing in the lobby pretending to read a newspaper. Every dollar from the sale of the tower went into a fund called the Company 19 Fund. And the fund did 2 things. It provided scholarships for people training in pre-hospital emergency care, and it maintained a fleet of volunteer ambulances, serving low-income neighborhoods throughout the city, the places where emergency vehicles were usually the slowest to arrive. Otis Gallagher retired in the fall, but he didn't retire completely. He stayed on as an instructor for the first class of trainees, teaching them how to read a scene and how to write a report properly. And he taught the reporting section more carefully than anything else. His wife, Marguerite, had made it through another course of treatment and was able to move around more easily, and she often brought baked goods to the class on Friday afternoons. Junie Halloran took the certification exam and passed. She became a coordinator for the fund, but she didn't give up her morning delivery shifts, because she said that anyone sitting behind a dispatch desk who forgot what it felt like to carry a cold box through the rain would eventually make the wrong schedule. She still wore the orange coat with blue thread stitched across the elbow. One morning, at the fund's dispatch station, a young man new to the job stopped in front of 2 doors at the end of the hallway, holding a cooler in his arms, looking from one door to the other, and then back down at the delivery slip in his hand. He stood there long enough for his face to begin turning red. Junie happened to walk by, saw him, and stopped. What level is the order? He looked up, still hesitant. Level 1. Then this way. I'll show you. She walked ahead, pushed open the door on the left, and held it for him as he passed through. On the wall behind the duty desk hung a brass fire whistle, its body polished bright again, with a new leather strap. That strap came back to it on a rainy afternoon at the end of summer. Cormac came to the station and waited beneath the awning because she was busy with an ambulance run, and when she finally came outside, he handed her a small box. Inside was the whistle, shining almost like new, and a hand-stitched leather strap. "I borrowed it from you for a week," he said. "Someone from Company 19 made the strap for me." He said the old one had been broken for years, and no one had ever bothered to replace it. Junie picked it up and studied the strap for a while, then raised the whistle to her lips and blew. The sound rang out beneath the awning, carried through the rain, and several people standing across the yard turned to look. She lowered her hand and smiled. "The first day we met," he said, "you told me to take the harder way. I didn't tell you anything. I only said out loud what I was afraid of. To me, they're the same thing." She looked at him. "Do you regret it?" He didn't answer immediately. Rain ran in thin streams from the edge of the metal roof. "Yes, every day." Then he paused. "And I would make the same choice again." Junie reached out and took his hand, the one with a faint scar running along the knuckle. The two of them stood that way beneath the awning without saying anything more, while the rain fell steadily across the yard in front of the station. This story leaves us with 3 very simple truths. First, a person's dignity doesn't come from the clothes they wear or from the doors they are allowed to walk through. And anyone who measures another human being by those things will eventually measure them wrong. Second, silence is never free. The person who stays silent today may keep their job, but someone else will pay the price, on another morning, on some other stone floor. And third, no one is forever chained to the person they once were. Real power isn't the ability to make other people fear you. It is the ability to stop your own hand when no one is forcing you to stop. If today's story touched something in you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so that every day you can hear more stories worth listening to. We would truly like to know how you feel about Junie, about Otis, about Nuala, and about the choice Cormac made at the end of the story. So please leave a comment, even if it is only a few lines, so we can hear what you feel deep in your heart. We wish you and your family lasting good health, joyful days, and a peaceful life. Goodbye for now, and we hope to see you again in the next video.